Hello, Life Science, and welcome back to our study of plants, to the study of botany. Last time, a lot of our attention was spent on the different tissue types in plants, and then we spent a lot of time on their leaves. Today, we're going to be talking about roots and stems. Talking about all these parts of the bodies of plants honestly just kind of makes me think about fruits and vegetables, because we do know all of these parts of plants just from our refrigerators. For example, you know that we do eat leaves. Maybe you don't want to, but you know, you're supposed to. Sigh. It's good. We do eat the seeds as well, even if we, pop them first. They go together better than I thought. And we eat roots. What? It's a carrot. All right. So another part of the plant we eat is fruit. We're going to talk about fruit a lot a little later. But there's one part that I don't think you ever eat, do you? This little guy right here. You ever eat the stem? No? I didn't think so. Stem doesn't get a lot of love, does it? Well, we're going to be talking about roots and stems. Maybe the stem will get a little bit of love this time. Who knows? But let's begin with the roots. Roots perform three important functions for plants. First, they absorb water and nutrients from the plant's surroundings and transport them to where they are needed. I mean, I think you probably knew this, that when you're watering plants, you don't pour water on the leaves, you pour them on the roots. Well, on the soil above their roots, with the hope that the roots would absorb that water and transport it to the leaves. Besides absorbing nutrients and water, roots also anchor the plant. They keep the plant, rooted in the ground so that they don't just, fall over or blow away. And last of all, food storage. Plants produce food in their leaves, but they store food in their roots. So three important functions for roots: absorbing nutrients and water, anchoring, and food storage. Now, roots usually grow underground, but there are some exceptions. For example, the epiphytic orchid winds around the branches of tropical trees and has aerial roots to cling to branches and absorb material they collect in the cracks. So instead of getting their nutrition from soil, it actually picks it up from dirt that's on trees. Now, we talked about parasites back when we were doing fungi. Parasites, that's one form of symbiotic relationships, along with commensalism and mutualism. If you remember, a parasite benefits at the expense of its host, harming its host, actually. There are parasitic plants. Did you know that? For example, mistletoe is a parasitic plant. It doesn't just make Christmas awkward. No, it also hurts trees. It sinks its roots into a host, stealing its nutrients. Mistletoe. Man. So ivy has roots that hold them onto rough surfaces, like walls or bark. That's how they're able to grow up trees and the sides of buildings. So roots have two types that they might belong to. First, there are fibrous root systems. So the first primary root, it branches extensively. This is so that it can have lots and lots of surface area, because water and nutrients can only pass from the soil into the plant through a surface. So the more surface area you have, the more absorption you can do. Taproot systems are the other kind, and in that, the first primary root grows and stays the main root. So you might think of it almost like the trunk. It stays long and doesn't branch extensively like the fibrous roots do. So plants need significantly more surface area in their roots than in their leaves. The leaves do exchange gases with the atmosphere through the stomata, but they only do it for themselves. So the roots have to do it for the entire plant. Most root systems are larger than the plant above the ground. So roots have 4 longitudinal sections. Now, a longitudinal section means you're looking at sections along the length of it. So we're looking at the root from bottom to top, from the end up to where, it's above ground. So at the end of the root is the root cap. It's made of dead cells that have thick walls, and it protects the root as it shoves its way down into the soil. You could think of it like the armor at the front of it as it's plowing deeper into the dirt. Then there is the meristematic region. If you remember that as one of the 4 tissue types in plants, that's the one made of undifferentiated cells, like stem cells. It's just above the cap. And those undifferentiated cells carry on mitosis. That's where cells reproduce and divide. Most of the growth occurs here in the meristematic region. So we got the root cap, meristematic region, moving on to the elongation region. The cells are differentiating into specific cell types here. So the undifferentiated cells in the meristematic region that are dividing, in the elongation region, they actually choose a job. They become differentiated and specialized. Here the cells stretch out, elongation region, and they fill their central vacuoles with water. A central vacuole is an organelle in a plant cell, a vacuole just being a large storage area within the cytoplasm, and in a plant cell they fill with water. So there is also some growth here. The last region, right, we've had the root cap, the meristematic region, the elongation region, now we have the maturation region. This is where the cells are fully differentiated and often root hairs will be produced. This also increases the surface area. And if you remember, in the symbiosis part of the fungi, there are also some fungi that have symbiotic relationships with roots to help them increase their effective surface area by sharing nutrients from the soil with these root cells. So the roots have a microscopic lateral structure. They would be protected by an epidermis, which would be like, a single-celled layer around the outside. Now, there is what's called the cortex. These are cells inside the epidermis, and substances are stored here for later use. Epidermis means like on top of skin, epi, on top, dermis, skin. Endodermis means under or inside skin. Endo is inside or under, dermis is skin. So the endodermis is a 1-cell layer nearer the center, and it's surrounding the vascular chamber. Do you remember vascular tissue? If meristematic tissue is made of undifferentiated cells, vascular tissue had the 2 types, xylem and phloem. Remember, they were the tubes through which water and dissolved materials traveled through the plant. So here's the vascular chamber. This contains the xylem and the phloem. Any substance that's headed for the xylem or the phloem must pass through the vascular chamber. This protects the rest of the plant from unwanted substances. You can think of it kind of like a filter. So more microscopic lateral structure. First, we've got the vascular cambium. These are undifferentiated tissue between the xylem and the phloem, which can form whatever the plant needs. There's also the pericycle, which kind of sounds like it would be a lot of fun to ride, but this is actually part of a plant. These are undifferentiated cells in the cambium, which become new branches. a branch forms and breaks out of the endodermis, traveling through the cortex and the epidermis. Moving on to stems. So stems have three basic functions. First, they support and manufacture leaves. And of course you need leaves because they do photosynthesis, so anything that supports and manufactures leaves, also important. They conduct water and nutrients to and from the leaves. They also can carry on photosynthesis. Now, in some plants, they only do it when the plant is young, before it's had a chance to grow a lot of leaves. But in other plants, such as a cactus, they are actually the primary agent of photosynthesis. So if you remember, there are two different types of plants that have woody stems and herbaceous stems. Herbaceous stems have an epidermis on the outside that protects the stem. Mature herbaceous stems' epidermis actually can't grow any further. So herbaceous stem can't grow continually, or it would just rupture the epidermis. This is actually one of the reasons why herbaceous stems are either annuals or biennials, because they can't continually grow. As soon as they reach a mature size, the epidermis can't grow anymore, and if it were to grow any longer, it would just burst out of its own epidermis. And that's bad. Herbaceous stems have fibrovascular bundles that contain xylem and phloem. It's kind of like a wire running through a larger cable. If you've ever had like a really large cable, maybe like for like a big stereo system that's got like a video signal running through it and an audio signal running through it, and they're on their own separate wires. Or maybe like how you have an HDMI cable, which actually has a bunch of wires running through it, or like a network cable or a phone line, anything that has a whole bunch of wires running inside of it. That's what a fibrovascular bundle is, except obviously it's not wires conducting electricity. They are bundles of xylem and phloem carrying water and dissolved materials. The cortex contains photosynthetic cells, and it also stores starch in an herbaceous stem. So we're done with herbaceous stems. Let's talk about woody stems. Woody stems you know from, trees. So anything that we're describing now, it might make you think about trees. So bark, right? That's one of the features of a woody stem. There's inner bark, which contains cortex tissue and phloem. Besides the inner bark, we've also got the cork cambium. Cork cambium is a layer of tissue between the inner and outer bark that produces cork cells. Outer bark are cork cells that die quickly, and then they are impenetrable to water, gases, and most parasites. So as you're looking at a woody stem on the inside, or I should say along the rim of a woody stem, three layers are inner bark, cork cambium, and outer bark. The cork from the cork cambium dies and becomes impenetrable to water, gases, and most parasites. So the way that bark works is it permits continual growth as opposed to herbaceous stems. So what happens is the outer bark on the outside of a woody stem will rupture, which would be the death of an herbaceous stem. However, because there is inner bark inside of the outer bark, when the outer bark ruptures, then the cork cambium from the inner bark just replaces it. So a tree trunk is like the main stem, and the reason that it has such rough bark is because it's constantly and continually outgrowing the bark it had previously. So the smooth surface of bark it had when it was a sapling ruptures, and in the break, cork cambium from the inner bark replaces it, and so you end up with this really rough surface. Now, there are some trees whose bark peels rather than breaks. You might think of it almost like a snake skin peeling off instead of breaking through. And it results in a smooth trunk, kind of like a white birch tree. So woody stems, trees, are also marked by something that you've probably heard of, and that's annual growth rings. These are alternating bands of light and dark wood that form annually every year. So here's how this works. The vascular cambium produces phloem on its outer side and xylem on its inner side. So the two sides of vascular cambium have different kinds of vascular tissue on them. Phloem on the outside, xylem on the inside. When xylem cells die, they form what we call the wood of the tree. Wood is just xylem. Large xylem produced in spring when water is plentiful. That's lighter wood. I don't mean like lighter weight. I mean it's lighter in color. They're larger xylem, larger holes. Smaller xylem are produced in summer when water is more scarce. So the wood is darker. Every year you go through a period of more available water and less available water. And that determines the size of the xylem in the woody stem. When the xylem dies and becomes wood, when it was larger xylem, the wood is lighter in color. When they were smaller xylem, the wood is darker in color. That happens once every year following the cycle of the availability of water. Dendrochronology is the method of dating tree rings and the environmental conditions that accompanied their formation. You can actually determine how old a tree is based on how many annual growth cycles it's been through. Now, there are sometimes weird little hiccups in that. For example, remember that the bright and dark spots or rings are determined by the availability of water. So rings during a dry season or a drought will look different than rings during a fairly wet season. Okay? But they'll also preserve signs of environmental conditions that were present at the time. For example, if there was a volcanic eruption one year during a tree's life and there was a lot of ash or dark material that got incorporated into the soil, that may be reflected in that year's tree ring. So there are a couple really old trees that we've been able to determine the age of by this method. First, there is Methuselah, which is a 4,845-year-old Great Basin bristlecone pine in the White Mountains of California. I actually wrote that date a couple years ago. So it's even older now. There's another tree of the same type. It's 5,062 years old. You can actually look these up and they'll tell you that their locations are a carefully, closely guarded secret. Because, well, I mean, you could just imagine what someone would do if they knew where the oldest tree was. They'd probably, I don't know, cut it down or something. People, So there is something that you can do to woody stems called girdling. Girdling is the process of cutting away a ring of inner and outer bark all the way around a tree trunk. So xylem carry water and minerals up the stem, and they're in the inner part of the stem. The phloem carry food and organic materials, and they're part of the inner bark as well. Girdling severs the phloem. Remember, they're on the outer part of the inner bark. Of the vascular cambium, but not the xylem. So if you cut the phloem, but you leave the xylem, then roots can feed the leaves, but the leaves can't feed the roots. So the roots will eventually starve to death, and the tree will die. Sorry to have to lay that on you, but, I think you're old enough that it's time that you learn. Moving on. there are some specialized stems that are actually underground. We think of some stems as being above ground, but actually some of them grow underground as well. So a bulb is a particular kind of branch. It's not a root. It is a branch. It's a collection of underground leaves that sprout from an underground stem. They don't perform photosynthesis. Instead, it's used for storage. And a good example of a bulb would be an onion. If you've ever cut open an onion, you've noticed all the layers. Those are all specialized leaves growing from a stem that just store food. Another kind of stem is a tuber. And again, that is an underground stem that is used to store excess food. And a good example of that is a potato. So we don't eat stems. Well, actually we do. We just cook them first.